Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. In this video we're going to be doing a presentation on consumer data protection laws, and more specifically in this presentation we want to cover how the United States stacks up against the rest of the world in terms of consumer data protection legislation and policies. So let's move on. The US does not have an all-encompassing law to cover all types of personal data. There are a few specific laws which are meant to protect very specific use cases and types of personal data. For example, HIPAA is specifically for protecting patient identifiable information. So when you exchange your health data with a healthcare provider, they are regulated by HIPAA on what they can do with with that data, how they can share it, how they need to protect it, and this was one of the first few laws in terms of actually protecting your consumer data. The U.S. Privacy Act of 1974 is specifically for how the government can use your data when it collects it. So, for example, information on your tax forms and things like that. They can't share it willy-nilly, stuff like that. COPPA is specifically for young children, so I believe it's kids under the age of 13 are protected by COPPA, and it essentially just says that the parent has to sign off on any sharing of personal data of their child because they have legal custody over their child. Additionally to this, some states have decided that they would like to add more on top of the federal laws. So there are some state laws within the United States that protect consumers a bit more in those states. But as we can see further in the presentation, those individual state laws, while they do protect the residents of that state, it's difficult to enforce, especially within a company that operates countrywide or worldwide. It makes it very difficult to specifically implement state laws, and they're just not as strong as the federal laws in other areas. Specifically worldwide, in places like the EU, the European Union, and China, they have recently created laws that cover the entirety of personal consumer data. So information like PII, personally identifiable information, and in the European Union we have legislation called the GDPR. This legislation and set of laws is specifically for how companies are allowed to use that data, where they can store it. And in China, they have the PIPL. Globally, as laws are made like the GDPR in the EU, service providers are forced to respond. So service providers, i.e. companies like Facebook, Google, etc., service providers who do serve users in the GDPR affected countries, so essentially anyone in the European Union, must have the data privacy in mind for the GDPR, and they must achieve the goals that are set out by the GDPR. This can have a trickle-down effect where some companies might decide that they just want to implement these regulations across their entire company. So whether you're a US user, whether you're a user in another foreign country, or whether you're a user in the European Union, you're protected by these GDPR rules. Additionally, the GDPR also helps us raise this conversation in places where the GDPR doesn't cover. So places like the United States. And a lot of companies are resistant to implementing GDPR protections for all of their user base across the entire globe because it requires extra cost and due diligence on their side. It's much easier for them to just implement it in the European Union where they serve the European Union users. So let's move on. Currently, the only federally protected personal information in the United States is healthcare data or data collected from minors or data collected at a federal level for government programs. In the United States, you have very little legal right to request how a company uses your data, and you do not have very good rights in terms of choosing what data is actually collected. It essentially puts you at the mercy of the user agreement set forth by the company that you're using, and they decide how you can use the data, how they can use your data. Some states, like we mentioned earlier, for example, California and Colorado, have implemented additional privacy laws over the federal level. So these are mainly controlling what the company is allowed to collect on you, and you're allowed to view the data that they've collected, opt in or opt out of it, things like that. And a lot of times you see this on newer websites where they ask you about cookies and what they're allowed to collect and whether they should be just collecting the minimum level or above that. And oftentimes when you put the user in a place where they have to decide, they choose the easiest option. And many times these companies make the easiest option just a collect all button, where they are allowed legally at that point, because you've allowed them to collect all the information that they'd like to. The European Union's GDPR regulation is the most comprehensive data protection laws that have been passed currently. That's sort of opinion, but most people are agreeing that it is the most comprehensive law that we have now. It ensures that your data is stored in a way where it's lawfully accessed, not shared illegally. There's all kinds of protections that are presented in the GDPR, and one of the major things with the GDPR is that the company is liable for making sure that your data is protected. There's a minimum standard that is required by the company, and it's not a situation where they ask the user what they'd like to collect. It's a minimum standard that the company is allowed to collect. And they also have to keep good hold of the data. They can't just accidentally leak it and not have any ramifications to leaking it. There are pretty hefty fines for leaking data, and the EU's GDPR really puts a lot of earnest on the companies to ensure that it's protecting users' data appropriately. For customers inside the United States, this means that they either benefit from the GDPR laws because the company just decides that they would like to implement this worldwide, or they get stuck relying on their own state laws to protect them. And as we covered earlier, these state laws are nothing in comparison to the GDPR. The GDPR puts all of the earnest on the company to protect your data, while the state laws typically just allow you to choose what the company is collecting and don't really put a lot of responsibility on the company to ensure that your data is protected properly. This difference creates a huge disparity between US and EU customers, and users in these different areas have vastly different experiences on these sites, as well as legal protections for their data. A breach in the United States might come with a small fine, whereas a breach in the EU would come with a hefty fine and huge questioning, as well as auditing of your systems before you're allowed to serve customers again. Consumers would clearly benefit from a standard set of rules which any company delivering to any user in any location would be required to follow. This would be worldwide law, essentially, or common law across the entire world, requiring a minimum standard. The only thing I can think of that's similar to this is like uh, war crime law that's commonly recognized across all countries or something like that. And even then, it's not recognized across all countries. But it would be incredibly difficult to determine laws that are recognized worldwide. But instead of that, we could have laws that are commonly accepted and implemented appropriately in each country. However they decide to word it, but they essentially would have the same impact across each country, requiring that companies are actually careful with your data, like the EU has implemented. Recently, we've come into an evolution of emerging threats against your personal data. The recent rise in use of large language model AI technology, uh, consumers are left very much in the dark as to how their personal data is being used. And it's even more so scary that companies are pushing AI technology and they don't even fully understand the ramifications of allowing AI technology access to their company data. Um, it's proven that AI is a mystery in many companies, yet they still choose to blindly implement these technologies in order to keep up with the competition. Everyone's doing it, and if you're not doing it, you're behind. It's the mentality these companies hold. Classically, policy always falls far behind technological advancements, and in this case, large language model AI has been developing so rapidly and implemented so ubiquitously that issues stemming from this in the future could have a scope much, much wider than we previously have seen with consumer data protection issues. The rapid advancement in the AI field will likely cause a lot of future problems for us when we do try to regulate personal data sharing. And I applaud the EU for trying to get ahead of this. I feel that they've done a good job. It's important to recognize why these consumer data protections need to be implemented. For many people, it may seem unimportant when a company accidentally leaks your email or your name or even your address might just seem like public information at this point. Um, but personal data sharing has evolved to a point where companies are actively sharing data between each other in order to build more complete data sets on you. So companies would like to know as much as they can about you. This is why they tend to suggest collecting as much data as possible from you. With all of this data, they're able to build a better profile on you and market better to you. It helps their bottom line in every way to have as much data as possible on you. So these companies are actively purchasing data from each other. They're building larger data sets. And a company that might have only asked you for your email and name in the beginning now maybe knows your social security number and your street address and where you work and your political beliefs and things of this nature. Sure, in the past we've recognized that having your social security number and name leaked is a risk to you because people can steal your identity and take out loans in your name. But let's think a little bit deeper on this. For example, if your insurance company is sharing data with your car manufacturer and your phone manufacturer, maybe Google is sharing some data on where you've been, and all of these companies are sharing data with each other willy-nilly without good protections, suddenly you might find yourself in a place where you go to renew your car insurance and you're denied because the car insurance company decides that you're too much of a risk to them because Google says that you drive kind of erratically, or Google says that you went to a bar and then drove home, or your car manufacturer says that you haven't been maintaining your car, and suddenly you find yourself without insurance because the car insurance company knows more than you would willingly provide to them. Uncontrolled personal data sharing can have implications that maybe are currently legal in the United States. It's perfectly legal for an insurance company to purchase data from another company as long as it hasn't been explicitly denied. But these practices are horrible for the consumer and can cause many problems, as I outlined in my prior theoretical example. In conclusion, it's always important to protect your personal data, and data sharing without controls, as it is currently in the US, can be extremely, extremely problematic for consumers in the future. It's very important for consumers to understand their rights and to advocate for the protection of their personal data. I feel it's also important that while you try to help your local government and your federal government build regulation on this, we also have to hold companies accountable for when they egregiously share personal data in a negligent manner. As much as we allow companies to share our personal data and get away with accidentally leaking personal data, it just creates this environment where the companies are not incentivized to prevent it. They just allow it to happen because it doesn't cost them anything and it benefits them greatly. That's my presentation. Here are my sources for this data. Thank you for viewing this presentation. I hope it was informative to you.